powered by Tandem HR. Heard Sunday evenings at 6.
Listen to podcasts of Joe Walsh and Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We're talking about Chicago a little bit today with the arrest of Gropo Proco Joe Moreno. Maybe this will be a false police report. Prosecution Kim Fox will actually green light.
He's been charged with 2 felony counts, taken into custody last night, had to spend the night in jail, and he has bond hearing today at 26 and Cal.
And we talked to Rafael Mangual from the Manhattan Institute about his piece on Tiny Dancer trying to rewrite his history as mayor to be one where he was a police reformer and a crime reducer.
I'm sorry. It still makes me laugh, and it's actually a slap in the face for everyone who lost a loved one to gun violence in Chicago.
Well, and this
but now he's touting his accomplishments, and your loved one died? No.
Not as bad as Baltimore is essentially his argument, at least since 2016. Not particularly compelling stuff, but all the conversation in Chicago is always about the political class. And you have the murder or violent crime du jour on the nightly newscast, and you become a nerd to it. But you forget, particularly because this mainly happens in neighborhoods where the powerful don't live, the wealthy don't live. You forget these other human beings, and that you have thousands of people shot every year who do survive thanks to great medical professionals and quick response from first responders who do survive. And what of the trauma, the community, the individual trauma, as well as the neighborhood and cultural trauma of the endemic violence in Chicago, in particular neighborhoods with special emphasis? Well, Alex Kotlowitz, who is the author of a book about Chicago housing projects, which was quite celebrated, this is back 25 years ago, called There Are No Children Here, examines exactly what we're describing. He's got a new book, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, and he joins us now to discuss it. Alex, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So the impetus for your book and what it attempts to do in addressing the violence in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing about these communities for some 30 years now, and been both confounded and deeply unsettled by the stubborn persistence of the violence. And I remember well after the tragic shooting in Newtown, and then it happened again in Parkland. We were asking all the right questions, like how individuals in a community move on after such a unbearable tragedy, and yet we're not asking those questions in places like Garfield Park or Austin or Englewood, and we need to. And I think there's a myth out there that somehow people get accustomed or hardened or numb to the violence, and I think we've completely underestimated the impact of the violence on both the spirit of individuals and the spirit of community.
Well, you tell stories in your book, and to bring what you just said home, to give it human form. Give us an example of what you're speaking of.
Sure. There's one story about a remarkable woman, Lisa Daniels, who was living in Englewood. She was a single mother to 2 boys. The older one was a engineering student at University of Illinois, and her younger one, Darren, in high school began to stray. He began to get involved in selling drugs, and she did everything she could to hold him tight, and then finally had to ask him to leave the house. And when Darren was 25, he went to buy some marijuana from a drug dealer down in Park Forest down on the south side and in the south suburbs. And I don't think neither of them came with the best of intentions, and a shootout ensued, and Darren was killed. And so the first thing that happens is the local newspaper, and this happens so often, in the headline talked about how this young man with felony convictions had been killed in the community, and I don't think they mentioned Darren's name until the second or third paragraph, and all they talked about was his time in prison, all his arrests, and Lisa wanted to reclaim his narrative. I mean, she wasn't in denial. She knew what he had done, but wanted everyone to know that he was a much richer, fuller, complicated individual than that story indicated. And In fact, she got her license plate holder reads, "He was my son. His name was Darren." But the other thing that happens with her is that she expects it's going to be a pretty straightforward case, that the shooter is going to be convicted and sent away to prison for a long time, and at some point the prosecutor comes to her and says, the case is more complicated than we thought. He's pleading self-defense, and the one witness we have is somebody who's got a criminal record, so not the best witness, and we're thinking of offering him a plea deal. Are you on board with that? And Lisa thinks about it for a bit, and she says, okay, I'll do that, but only if I can read a victim impact statement at his sentencing. And usually when people come and read victim impact statements, they talk about how the crime has impacted them and their family, and Lisa gets up there in the courtroom and talks about her son, how he was more than just this one moment in his life, and then goes on to ask for leniency for this person who killed her son, that he too was more than that one moment, and ends up forgiving him. In fact, she starts a correspondence with him in prison. I mean, it's just a remarkable story about forgiveness.
Wow. That's are they still talking to this day?
No, well, not at the moment, no. But they were when he was in prison. They were still corresponding. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's these restorative justice programs. I think actually 60 Minutes just profiled one, something like that, connecting victim to perpetrator or victim's family to perpetrator.
Yeah, and Van Jones has a series right now on CNN.
But
right. In fact, Lisa has now started a foundation in her son's name around restorative justice. Something she's learned about since.
But again, because you've got a 30-year perspective, you may, and I know you make the point that this is not a policy book. This is not, I know how to solve this, or somebody else knows how to solve this. But what have you seen in the last 30 years? How have things changed, improved, metastasized, some combination of all of that?
Right. So, I mean, I think that, it's interesting that, as bad as things are now, as bad as the violence is, it was considerably worse, 25, 30 years ago, and yet it feels just as intense now. And I think that part of that is because the gangs have really broken apart, and, the police estimate there are 600 to 800 different factions, cliques, crews around the city, organized block by block, and the violence feels more arbitrary, more random. The other part of it, of course, is 25, 30 years ago, so much of the violence was happening in public housing, just completely out of sight,
right,
out of mind. For me, the most encouraging thing that's happened in recent years is this movement to consider violence as a matter of public health, to recognize that this is not solely a law enforcement problem. And I think we've made that mistake in the past, to think that this is a problem that's going to be solved by law enforcement. And some of the most inventive and creative programs directly grapple with the trauma, especially of the young men they're working with.
What about the other civic institutions that set young people, since we're mainly talking about young people here that are turned on to gangs and crime?
Right. Well, the commonality, and I should back up and just say that Chicago, as bad as it is, kind of the poster child. It's not even in the top 10 most violent cities in the country. I mean, there's St. Louis, Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans. I could go on. I mean, I could have written this book in so many different places, but the one common element in all these neighborhoods that are sort of where you see this stubborn, persistent violence is that these neighborhoods are deeply distressed, communities that are economically struggling. And it feels so self-evident, I almost feel sheepish to even say it, but we've got to find a way to rebuild and refortify these communities, which in turn will ultimately rebuild and refortify family, which is, the most important institution out there.
Right. I mean, don't we need more fathers in the children's lives? Would that help?
Well, it's not so much that we need more fathers, but we need to find a way to support families. Families come in all shapes and sizes, but I do think that if you're living in communities where jobs are hard to come by, where there's little sense of hope or a future, where the schools are not functioning as they should, you begin to lose a sense of future. You begin to sort of give up. I remember years ago there was a guy who used to work at the World Bank, Paul Collier, who wrote this book, The Bottom Billion, about the developing world, in which he talked about how, in places like Chad, where there's poverty across the board. There's very little violence. It's only in countries in which there's great disparities of wealth. And he comes to Chicago and goes to Englewood, and he realized this is it. You walk out your door in Englewood and you look at this gleaming, beautiful skyline. I think the most beautiful downtown in the world, and you know what's not yours. And how can you not become bitter?
But there is still this issue of, yes, sure, Detroit, Baltimore, other cities, but when you have a major urban center like Chicago that has a higher murder rate than New York and L.A. combined with diverse populations, throw Houston in there too. The populations are just as diverse. The wealth disparity is not dissimilar. There's something else going on in Chicago that isn't going on in those other big cities.
Right. Well, I would argue that actually in New York, one of the things that's happened in New York over the years, you're right, New York and L.A. are kind of the outliers, and New York has been incredible. I grew up there. It's been incredibly gentrified in the past 30 years, and so it is a place of the wealthy. It's really hard to live in the city without having some resources. It's pushed the poor outside the boundaries. The other thing about New York is that the states around New York have pretty tight gun control laws, so it's much more difficult to get access to guns if you're living in New York than it is in Chicago.
In the book, one of the things that one of the riffs that was really poignant, you wrote, the acronym RIP, rest in peace, is everywhere. It's penned on the sheets of poster board hanging by these makeshift memorials. It's tattooed on people's bodies, painted on the walls of apartments, scrawled on the side of buildings, embossed on T-shirts and jackets. It's as if these communities are piecing together the equivalent of a war memorial. The culture of death that hangs over these neighborhoods, I don't think we have a full appreciation for it unless you live there.
No, and the numbers are just staggering. I mean, you look at the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, and 14,033 people killed in the city, and another 60,000 wounded by gunfire. Those numbers are just astonishing. And what does that do to the spirit of both individuals and, as you suggest, the spirit of community?
Well, and also too, anybody who can get out gets out. One of the underreported aspects of the flight from Chicago between the last two censuses was that it was 200,000 black families that left because they don't want to live in shooting galleries any more than anybody else.
Right. And there are two stories in my book of young people who both make an effort to physically remove themselves from their communities. And what does that say about us that you don't feel safe and secure in your own home, in your own neighborhood?
Alex Kotlowitz, journalist, filmmaker, Peabody and DuPont award-winning author. His previous book, some 3 decades ago, There Are No Children Here, about Chicago housing projects. His latest, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. Alex, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy J.